Goldman knew the area from many previous rides. The knight owned a barn beyond the frozen marsh, and farther on there was a farmhouse where he was known. He'd be able to rest and spend the night in one of those places. Everything else had to wait until tomorrow. Gradually, the feeling of freedom and detachment took hold of him again. He had grown unaccustomed to it. It did not have a pleasant taste on this icy, gloomy winter day. It smelled of hardship, hunger, and want. And yet the vastness of it, its great expanse, its merciless harshness, was almost comforting and soothing to his spoiled, confused heart. He walked until he felt tired. My riding days are over, he thought. Oh, wide world. A little snow was falling. In the distance, the edges of the forest fused with gray clouds. Infinite silence stretched to the end of the world. What was happening to Lydia, that poor, anguished heart? He felt bitterly sorry for her. He thought of her tenderly as he rested under a bare, lonely ash in the middle of the deserted marshland. Finally, the cold drove him on. Stiff-legged, he stood up, forced himself to a brisk pace. The meager light of the drab day already seemed to be dwindling. The slow trot across the bare fields put an end to his musing. It was not a question of thinking now or of having emotions. No matter how delicate and beautiful, it was now a question of keeping alive, of reaching a spot for rest. Of reaching a spot for the night and time. Of getting through this cold, inhospitable world like a marten or a fox, and not giving out too soon in the open fields. Everything else was unimportant. He thought he heard the sound of distant hooves and looked around in surprise. Could anyone be following him? He reached for the small hunting knife in his pocket and slipped off the wooden sheath. The rider became visible. He recognized a horse from the knight's stable. Stubbornly, it was heading toward him. Fleeing would have been useless. He stopped and waited, without actual fear, but very tense and curious, his heart beating faster. For a second, a thought shot through his head. If I killed this rider, how well off I'd be. I'd have a horse, and the world would be mine. But when he recognized the rider, the young stable boy Hans, with his light blue, watery eyes and the good, embarrassed boy's face, he had to laugh. To murder this good dear fellow, one would have to have a heart of stone. He greeted Hans with a friendly hand and tenderly patted Hannibal, the horse, on its warm, moist neck. It recognized him immediately. "Where are you headed, Hans?" he asked. "To you," laughed the boy with shining teeth. "You've run a good distance. I can't stay. I'm only here to give you regards and this." "Regards from whom?" "From Lady Lydia. Well, you certainly gave us a nasty day, Master Goldmund. I was glad to get away for a while. But the squire must not know that I've been gone, and with that errand that could cost me my neck. Here." He handed him a small package. Goldmund took it. "I say, Hans, you don't happen to have a piece of bread in one of your pockets that you might give me?" "Bread? I might find a crust." He rummaged in his pockets and pulled out a piece of black bread. Then he wanted to ride off again. "How was the lady?" asked Goldmund. "Didn't she give you any message? No little letter?" "Nothing. I saw her only for a moment. There's a storm at the house, you know. The squire is pacing like King Saul. She told me to give you these things and nothing else. I've got to get back now." All right, just a moment more. Say, Hans, you couldn't let me have your hunting knife. I've only a small one. When the wolves come and all that, it would be better if I had something solid in hand." But Hans would not hear of that. He'd be very sorry, he said, if something should happen to Master Goldmund. But he could not part with his jackknife. No, never, not for money, nor a swap either. No, no, not even if Saint Genevieve in person asked him for it. There and now he had to get on a move. He had to get a move on, and he did not wish him well, and he did feel sorry about everything. They shook hands and the boy rode off. Goldman looked after him with a strange pain in his heart. Then he unpacked the things, happy to have the strong calf's leather cord that held them together. Inside, he found the knitted undervest of thick gray wool, which apparently Lydia had made for him. And there was also something hard, well wrapped in the wool, a piece of ham. A small slit had been cut into the ham, and a shiny gold piece had been stuck into the slit. There was no written message. He stood in the snow, undecided, holding Lydia's gifts in his hands. Then he took off his jacket and slipped into the knitted vest. It felt pleasantly warm. Quickly he put his jacket back on, hid the gold piece in his safest pocket, wound the cord around his waist, and continued his walk across the fields. It was time he reached a place to rest. He had grown very tired, but he didn't feel like going to the farmhouse, although it would have been warmer, and he'd probably also have found some milk there. He didn't feel like chatting and being asked questions. He spent the night in the barn, continued on his way early the next morning, in frost and sharp wind, driven to long marches by the cold. For many nights he dreamed of the knight with his sword and of the two sisters. For many days loneliness and melancholy weighed on his heart. The following evening he found a place for the night in a village, where the peasants were so poor they had no bread, only gruel. Here new adventures awaited him. During the night, the peasant woman, whose guest he was, gave birth to a child. Goldman was present while it happened. They had walked him in the straw to come and help, although there was nothing for him to do finally, except hold the light while the midwife went about her business. For the first time, he witnessed a birth. With astonished, burning eyes, he gazed at the face of the woman in labor, richer suddenly by the new experience. At any rate, the expression in the woman's face seemed most remarkable to him. In the light of the torch, he stared with great curiosity into the face of the screaming woman, lying there in pain. He was struck by something unexpected. The lines in the screaming woman's distorted face were little different from those he had seen in other women's faces during the moment of love's ecstasy. True, the expression of great pain was more violent and disfiguring than the expression of ultimate passion, but essentially it was not different. It was the same slightly grinning contraction, the same sudden glow and extinction. Miraculously, without understanding why, he was surprised by the realization that pain and joy could resemble each other so closely. And yet another experience awaited him in that village. The morning after the birth, he ran into the neighbor's wife, who soon replied to the amorous questioning of his eyes. He stayed a second night and made the woman very happy, since it was the first time in many weeks of exultation and disappointment that his desires were finally stilled. This delay led to a new experience. He found a companion on that second day in the village, a lanky, darling fellow named Victor, who looked half like a priest and half like a highway robber. Victor greeted him with scraps of Latin, claiming to be a traveling student, although he was long past his student years. He wore a pointed beard and treated Goldman with a certain heartiness and highway humor that quickly won the younger man. To Goldman's questions, where he had studied and where he was headed, this strange fellow replied, "By my destitute soul, I have visited enough places of high learning. I've been to Cologne and to Paris, and few scholars have expressed deeper thoughts on the metaphysics of liverwurst than I in my dissertation at Leyden. Since then, Amicus, I, poor bastard that I am, have crossed and recrossed the German Empire in all directions, my dear soul tortured by immeasurable hunger and thirst. Victor, the peasant terror, they call me. My profession is teaching Latin to young wives and tricking sausages out of chimneys and into my belly. My goal is the bed of the mayor's wife, and if the crows don't chew me up beforehand, I'll hardly be able to avoid the obligation of dedicating myself to the tiresome profession of archbishop. It is better, my dear young colleague, to live from hand to mouth than the other way around, and after all, a roasted hare has never been better than in my humble stomach. The king of Bohemia is my brother, and our Father in heaven feeds him as he does me, although he insists that I lend him a hand. And the day before yesterday, this father, hard-hearted as fathers are, tried to misuse me in order to save the life of a half-starved wolf. If I hadn't killed the beast, you, my dear colleague, would not have the honor of making my fascinating acquaintance. In secula seculorum, amen. Goldmund was unfamiliar with the gallows humor and wayfaring Latin of this wanderer. He felt a bit scared of the lanky, bristly rascal and the rasping laughter with which he applauded his own jokes. Yet there was something about this hard-boiled vagrant that did please him, and he readily let himself be persuaded to continue the journey with him, because, whether the vanquished wolf was boasting or the truth, two were indisputably stronger than one and had less to fear. But before continuing the journey, Brother Victor wanted to speak a bit of Latin to the people, as he called it, and installed himself in the house of one of the poorer peasants. He did not follow the practice Goldmund had so far applied on the road, whenever he had been the guest of a farmhouse or a village. Victor went from hut to hut, chatted with every woman, stuck his nose into every stable and kitchen, and did not seem willing to leave before each house had paid him a toll and tribute. He told the peasants about the war in Italy and sang, beside their hearths, the song of the Battle of Pavia. He mentioned remedies for arthritis and loose teeth to the grandmothers. He seemed to know everything, to have been everywhere. He stuffed his shirt above the belt, full to bursting with the pieces of bread, nuts, and dried pears the peasants had given him. With surprise, Goldmund watched him wage his campaign, listen to him now frightened, now flatter the people, boast and win their admiration, speak broken Latin, and play the scholar, and the next moment impress them with brash, colorful thief slang, and say how, in the middle of a tale or learned talk of his sharp, watchful eyes, recorded every face. I'm not going to read that again. With surprise, Goldmund watched him wage his campaign. Listen to him now frightened, now flatter the people, boast and win their admiration, speak broken Latin and play the scholar, and the next moment impress them with brash, colorful thief slang, saw how, in the middle of a tale or learned talk, his sharp, watchful eyes recorded every face, every table drawer that was pulled open, every dish, every loaf of bread. He saw that this was a seasoned adventurer who had been exposed to all walks of life, who had seen and lived through much, who had starved a good deal, and shivered, and grown shrewd and impudent in the bitter struggle for a meager, dangerous existence. So this was what became of people who led a wanderer's life for a long time. Would he too be like that one day? The next morning, as they moved on, for the first time, Goldmund had a taste of walking in company. For 3 days they were on the road together, and Goldmund found this and that to learn from Victor, applying everything to the 3 basic needs of the homeless: skirting death, finding a place for the night, and a source of food, had become an instinct with Victor. He had learned much during the many years of roaming the world, to recognize the proximity of human habitation by almost invisible signs, even in winter, at night, to inspect every nook and cranny in forest or field as a potential resting or sleeping place, to sense instantly, upon entering a room, the degree of prosperity or misery of the owner, as well as the degree of good-heartedness, or his curiosity, or fear. These were tricks which Victor had long since mastered. He told his young companion many instructive things. Once Goldmund replied that he would not like to approach people from such a purposeful point of view, and that, although he was unfamiliar with all these tricks, he had only rarely been refused hospitality upon his friendly request. Lanky Victor laughed and said good-humoredly, "Well, sure, little Goldmund, you may not have to. You're so young and pretty. You look so innocent. Your face is a good recommendation. The women like you, and the men think, 'Oh, Lord, he's harmless. He wouldn't hurt a fly.' But look here, little brother. A man gets older. The face grows a beard and wrinkles. Your pants wear out, and before you know it, you're an ugly, unwelcome guest. And instead of youth and innocence, nothing but hunger is staring out of your eyes. At that point, you've got to be hard. You've got to have learned a few things about the world, or else you'll soon find yourself lying on the dung heap, and the dogs will come and pee on you. But I don't think that you'll be running around for too long, anyhow. Your hands are too delicate, and your curls are too pretty. You'll crawl back to where life is easier, into a nice, warm, conjugal bed, or a good, fat cloister, or some beautifully heated writing room. And your clothes are so fine, you could be taken for a squire." Still laughing, he ran his hands over Goldmund's clothes. Goldmund could feel these hands grope and search along every seaman pocket. He drew back and thought of his gold piece. He told of his stay at the knight's house, that he had earned his fine clothes by writing Latin. Victor wanted to know why he had left such a warm nest in the middle of winter, and Goldmund, who was not accustomed to lying, told him a little about the knight's 2 daughters. This led to their first quarrel. Victor thought Goldmund was an incomparable fool for having run off and left the castle and the ladies in the care of the good Lord. That situation had to be remedied. He'd see to that. They'd visit the castle. Of course, Goldmund could not be seen there, but he should leave that to him. Goldmund was to write a little letter to Lydia, saying this and that he, Victor, would take it to the castle, and, by the Savior's wounds, he would not come back without a little something of this and that, money and loot, and so on. Goldmund refused and finally became violent. He did not want to hear another word about the matter, nor did he tell Victor the name of the knight or the way to the castle. When Victor saw him so angry, he laughed again and played the jovial companion. "Well," he said, "don't bite your teeth out. I'm merely telling you that you're letting a good catch slip through your fingers, my boy. That's not very nice and brotherly of you. But you don't want to. You're a nobleman. You'll return to your castle on a high horse and marry the lady. Boy, your head is bursting with nonsense. Well, it's all right with me. Let's walk on and freeze our toes off." Goldmund remained grumpy and silent until evening, but since they came neither upon a house nor upon people that day, he gratefully let Victor pick a piece for the night. Let him build a windbreak between 2 trees at the edge of the forest, and make a bed with an abundance of pine branches. They ate bread and cheese from Victor's full pockets. Goldmund felt ashamed of his anger and tried to be polite and helpful. He offered his companion his woolen jacket for the night. They agreed to take turns keeping watch against the animals, and Goldmund took over the first vigil while Victor lay down on pine branches. For a long time, Goldmund stood quietly with his back against a fir trunk in order not to keep the other man from falling asleep. Then he felt cold and began to pace. He ran back and forth at greater and greater distances, saw the tips of firs jet sharply into the pale sky, felt the deep silence of the solemn and slightly awesome winter night, heard his warm living heart beat lonely in the cold, echoless silence, walked quietly back and listened to the breathing of his sleeping companion. More powerfully than ever, he was seized by a feeling of homelessness, without a house, castle, or cloister wall between him and the great fear, running naked and alone through the incomprehensible hostile world, alone under the cool mocking stars, among the watchful animals, the patient, steady trees. No, he thought, he would never become like Victor, even if he wandered for the rest of his life. He would never be able to learn Victor's way of fighting the horror, his shy, thievish, squeaking by, his loud, brazen jests and wordy humor. Perhaps this shrewd, impudent man was right. Perhaps Goldmund would never completely become his equal, never altogether a vagrant. Perhaps he would someday creep back behind some sort of wall. Although even then he would remain homeless and aimless, never feel safe and protected. The world would always surround him with mysterious beauty and airiness. Again and again he would be made to listen to the silence in which his heartbeat sounded anguished and fleeting. Few stars were visible. There was no wind, but way up high in the clouds seemed to be moving. After a long time, Victor awoke. Goldmund had not felt like waking him, and called to him. Come, he called. Your turn to catch some sleep, or you'll be no good tomorrow. Goldmund obeyed. He stretched out on the pine bed and closed his eyes. He was extremely tired, but did not fall asleep. His thoughts kept him awake, and something else besides thoughts. A feeling he did not admit to himself, an uneasiness and distrust that had to do with his companion. It was inconceivable to him now that he had told this crude, loud laughing man, this jester and brazen beggar about Lydia. He was angry with him and with himself, and wondered how he would find a way and an opportunity to get rid of him. After about an hour or so, Victor bent over him and began feeling his pockets and seams. Goldmund froze with rage. He did not move. He merely opened his eyes and said disdainfully, "Go away. I have nothing worth stealing." His words shocked the thief. He grabbed Goldmund by the throat and squeezed. Goldmund fought back and tried to get up, but Victor pressed harder, kneeling on his chest. Goldmund could hardly breathe. Violently he writhed and jerked with his whole body, and then when he could not free himself, the fear of death shot through him and made his mind sharp and lucid. He managed to slip one hand in his pocket, pull out his small hunting knife, and while the other man continued strangling him, he thrust the knife several times into the body that was kneeling on him. After a moment, Victor's hands let go. There was air again, and Goldmund breathed deeply, wildly, savoring his rescued life. He tried to sit up. Limp and soft, his lanky companion sank into a heap on top of him, with a ghastly sigh. His blood ran over Goldmund's face. Only now was he able to sit up. In the gray shimmer of the night, he saw the long man lying in a huddle. He reached out to him and touched only blood. He lifted the man's head. It fell back, heavy and soft like a bag. Blood spilled from his chest and neck. From his mouth, life ran out in delirious, weakening sighs. Now I have murdered a man, thought Goldmund. Again and again he thought it, as he knelt over the dying man and saw pallor spread over his face. Dear Mother of God, I have killed a man, he heard himself say. Suddenly he could not bear to stay a moment longer. He picked up his knife, wiped it across the woolen vest which the other man was wearing, which Lydia's hands had knitted for her beloved. He slipped the knife back into its wooden sheath and into his pocket, jumped up, and ran away as fast as he could. The death of the cheerful wayfarer lay heavy on his soul. Shuddering as the day grew light, he washed away in the snow the blood he had spilled. And then he wandered about for another day and another night, aimless and anguished. Finally, his body needs shocked him out of his fear-filled repentance. Lost in the deserted, snow-covered landscape, without shelter, without a path, without food, and almost without sleep, he fell into a bottomless despair. Hunger cried in his belly like a wild beast. Several times exhaustion overcame him in the middle of a field. He closed his eyes and thought that his end had come, wished only to fall asleep, to die in the snow. But again and again something forced him back on his feet. Desperately, greedily, he ran for his life, delighted and intoxicated in the midst of bitter want by his insane, savage strength of will not to die, by this monstrous force of the naked drive to live. With frost-blue hands, he picked tiny, dried-up berries off of the snow-covered juniper bushes and chewed the brittle, bitter stuff, together with pine needles. The taste was excitingly sharp. He devoured handfuls of snow against his thirst. Breathless, blowing into his stiff hands, he sat on top of the hill for a brief rest. Avidly he looked about. Nothing but heath and forest, no trace of a human being. A few crows circled above him. He looked at them angrily. No, they were not going to feed on him. Not as long as there was an ounce of strength left in his legs, a spark of warmth in his blood. He got up and resumed his merciless race with death. He ran on, in a fever of exhaustion and ultimate effort. Strange thoughts took hold of him. He held mad conversations with himself, now silent, now loud. He spoke to Victor, whom he had stabbed to death. Harshly and ironically, he spoke to him. Well, my shrewd brother, how's it with you? Is the moon shining through your bowels, old fellow? Are the foxes pulling your ears? You killed a wolf, you say. Did you bite him through the throat, or tear off his tail, or what? You wanted to steal my gold piece, you old guzzler. But little Goldmouth surprised you, didn't he? He tickled you in the ribs. And all the while you still had a bag full of bread and sausage and cheese, you stuffed pig. He coughed and barked mockeries. He insulted the dead man. He triumphed over him. He jeered at him because he had let himself be slaughtered, the fool, the stupid braggart. But after a while, his thoughts and words turned away from lanky Victor. He saw Julie walking ahead of him. Beautiful little Julie, as she had left him that night. He called countless endearments to her, tried to seduce her with delirious, shameless cajoleries, to make her come to him, to make her drop her nightgown, to ride up to heaven with him during this last hour before death. For a short moment before this miserable end, he implored and commanded her high little breasts, her legs, the blonde, kinky hair under her arms. Trotting through the barren, snow-covered heath with stiff, stumbling legs, drunk with misery, triumphant with the flickering desire to live, he began to whisper. Now it was Narcissus to whom he spoke, to whom he communicated his recent revelations, insights, and ironies. Are you scared, Narcissus? He said to him. Are you shuddering? Did you notice something? Yes, my respected friend. The world is full of death. Full of death. Death sits on every fence, stands behind every tree. Building walls and dormitories and chapels and churches won't keep death out. Death looks through the window, laughing, knowing every one of you. In the middle of the night, you hear laughter, under your window and someone calls your name. Go ahead, sing your psalms, burn pretty candles at the altar, say your evening prayers and your morning prayers, gather herbs in your laboratory, collect books in your libraries. Are you fasting, dear friend? Are you depriving yourself of sleep? He'll lend you a hand, our old friend the Reaper. He'll strip you to the bones. Run, dear friend, run as fast as you can. Death is giving a party in the fields. Run and see that your bones stay together. They're trying to escape. They don't want to stay with us. Oh, our poor bones, our poor throat and belly, our poor little scraps of brains under our skulls. It all wants to become free. It all wants to go to the devil. The crows are sitting in the trees, those black-frocked priests. He had long since lost all sense of direction. He didn't know where he was running, what he was saying, whether he was lying or standing. He stumbled over bushes, ran into trees. Falling, he groped for snow and thorns. But the drive was strong in him. Again and again it pulled him forward, spurred his blind light. When he collapsed for the last time, it was in the same little village in which he had met the wayfaring charlatan a few days earlier, where he had held the torch during the night for the woman who was giving birth. There he lay, and people came running and stood about him and talked, yet he did not hear them. The woman whose love he had enjoyed earlier recognized him. She was shocked by the way he looked and took pity. Let her husband scold her. She dragged her half-dead Goldmund into the stable. It was not long before he was back on his feet. The warmth of the stable, sleep, and the goat's milk the woman gave him to drink revived him and let him recover his strength. But all recent events had been pushed back in his mind as though much time had passed since they happened. His journey with Victor, the cold, anguished winter night under the pines, the dreadful struggle on the bed of boughs, his companion's horrible death, the days and nights lost and cold and hungry. It had all become the past. He had almost forgotten it. Although it was not wiped out, it had been lived through and was nearly over. Something remained, something inexpressibly horrible, but also precious, something drowned and yet unforgettable, an experience, a taste on the tongue, a ring around the heart. In less than 2 years, he had learned all the joys and sorrows of homeless life. Loneliness, freedom, the sounds of forests and beasts, wandering, faithless loving, bitter, deathly want. For days he had been the guest of summery fields, of the forest, of the snow, had spent days in fear of death, close to death. Fighting death had been the strongest emotion of all, the strangest, knowing how small and miserable and threatened one was, and yet feeling this beautiful, terrifying force, this tenacity of life inside one during the last desperate struggle. It echoed, it remained etched in his heart, as did the gestures and expressions of ecstasy that so much resembled the gestures and expressions of birth-giving and dying. He remembered how the woman had screamed that night in childbirth, distorting her face, how Victor had collapsed, how quietly and quickly his blood had run out. Oh, and how he himself had felt death snooping around him on hungry days. And how cold he had been, how cold. And how he had fought, how he had struck death in the face with that mortal fear. What grim ecstasy he had defended himself. There was nothing more to be lived through, it seemed to him. Perhaps he could talk about it with Narcissus, but with no one else. When Goldmund first came to his senses on his bed of straw in the stable, he missed the gold piece in his pocket. He had lost it during the terrible, half-unconscious stumbling march during those final days of hunger. Oh, had he lost it? Yeah, I was like, why would they say it that way? He thought about it for a long time. He had been he had been fond of the gold piece. He did not want to think of it lost. Money meant little to him. He hardly knew its value, but this gold piece had become important to him for two reasons. It was the only gift from Lydia that was left him, since the woolen vest was lying in the forest with Victor soaked in Victor's blood. And then, keeping the gold coin had been the reason for defending himself against Victor. He had murdered Victor because of it. If the gold piece was lost, the whole experience of that ghastly night would be useless, would have no value. After much thinking about it, he confided in the peasant woman. Christine, he whispered to her, I had a gold piece in my pocket and now it's no longer there. Oh, so you noticed, she asked with a loving smile that was both sly and clever. It delighted him so much that he put his arm around her in spite of his weakness. What a strange boy you are, she said tenderly, so intelligent and refined, and yet so stupid. Does one run around the world with a loose gold piece in one's open pocket? Oh, you childish boy, you darling fool. I found your gold piece as soon as I laid you down on the straw. You did? Where is it? Find it. She laughed and let him search for it quite a while before she showed him a spot in his jacket where she had sewed it. She added good motherly advice too, which he quickly forgot. But he never forgot her loving care and the sly kind of look in her peasant face, and he tried hard to show her his gratitude. Soon he was able to walk again and eager to move on, but she held him back because on that day the moon was changing and the weather could be turning milder next. And so it was. By the time he left, the snow lay soiled and gray. The air was heavy with wetness. High up, one could hear the spring winds groan.